What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and in this video I'm going to be ranking all the dungeons in a tier list. Sundered Doctrine released recently, and with that we now have a total of 10 dungeons in Destiny 2. And I have no idea when we're getting the next one, and I'm transitioning to Monster Hunter soon, so I figured now would be the perfect time to make a dungeon tier list. Also, I've never done one of these, so I'm very excited as I've probably soloed and made more solo dungeon guides on this game than any other player in the community. But first, I want to talk about a few things. I don't have any strict criteria for the list, and I'm mostly going off of vibes. It is very hard to rank dungeons across different eras of Destiny 2. Shattered Throne was the first dungeon, and to solo it back in the day was an extremely difficult feat. And now you can smoke the final boss in like 2 Wardcliff coil shots. And the Pit of Heresy was also very difficult to solo back in the day, but now I can do it in about 20 minutes just for fun. So this list is going to be going on vibes, and I will also take into consideration the difficulty that it was at launch, as I have soloed all the dungeons pretty much when they came out, so I can somewhat compare them to modern day dungeons and how hard they are to solo. I will also consider how they are in a team environment, but given I'm a solo player, my bias will likely show. I will also rank them on things like aesthetic and mechanics, and I may talk about loot, but those won't really be factored into the rankings. This is because things like Pit of Heresy and Shattered Throne don't even have dungeon-specific loot or armor, but I don't think they should be knocked for that. More than anything, I care about how fun the dungeons are to run as a whole. I will also probably mention the solo flawless emblems, but again, that doesn't factor into the rankings. For me, the gameplay is king. So with all that out of the way, let's get into the rankings. We'll go in the order that they were released, meaning Shattered Throne is up first. This is the only dungeon where you didn't have to beat it without dying solo, you only had to solo it to get the emblem. It was also the first dungeon ever to be released. Bungie didn't even make any fanfare about it, they just let players discover it, and you could only run it every 3rd week when the curse on the Dreaming City was at its highest. How freaking cool is that? Wishender is the exotic tied to the dungeon, but other than that, there was no dungeon specific loot. The aesthetic is all black, white, and grey to match the Taken vibes, as they are the faction for this dungeon. The first encounter sees you take out a bunch of adds at a bunch of different plates, and when you clear every symbol, you move on to a long traversal. You have the bridge, and then you have skinny pillars to cross. Back in the day, this was all super threatening. The yellow bars guarding the plates were pretty difficult to kill, but now you can take them out with like 1 or 2 consecration slams. The captain and minotaur were also very scary back in the day, and the ogres on the pillars had to be dealt with. Then you got to the Thrallway, which didn't allow you to sprint or regen your health. Back in the day, you had to be careful here, but now you can just eager your way through it and use Restoration or Devour to get your health back. This first boss used to be really difficult. I remember struggling with a strategy to beat him for hours. You have to kill wizards before they kill you, all while the boss shoots its beam at you. And you have to kill them quickly because they drop a charge that you have to pick up or you die. And then you dunk it and deal damage to the boss. The boss can mess you up in a hurry with its floating orbs and its eye beam and its slam attacks. But again, all this is so much easier now than it used to be. After this, you have another long traversal section ending with the boop wall, which can definitely end a flawless run, and then you get to the final boss. This boss has a ton of multiplying scions and 3 huge knights. Again, you have to kill them all in quick succession so that you can grab the orbs that they drop to deal damage to the boss. If you don't have finite thought times 3, you will deal very little damage. Again, this was all so much harder to do back in the day. Now you can smoke the knights so quickly and then nuke the boss that you don't need much strategy at all. But way back when, you had to use movement to stay alive and slowly whittle down the knights while avoiding taking damage. In a fire team, this dungeon can be done super quickly, and even solo now, it can be done very fast. What is unique about this dungeon is it doesn't have repeatable mechanics where every other dungeon after this did. Bungie has definitely refined their dungeon formula, but the first one was experimental. There were tons of secrets in the Shattered Throne as well, which is really cool. And a hidden exotic quest to get Wishender that had additional mechanics and secrets. It was all super unique and cool when it first came out. And even though the combat difficulty is no longer there, if they brought it up to today's challenge level, I think it would age really well. For all these reasons, I think Shattered Throne deserves a solid A tier rating. The aesthetic is really damn cool. It feels so dark and grand and foreboding. The mechanics all being unique is a nice touch that you don't see anymore. It made the first playthrough really fun to try and solve and figure out. The traversals are long, but don't feel excessive, as they can be sped up on repeat run-throughs, making the pacing feel really nice. It's just a super solid dungeon and is worthy of an A tier rating. Up next, we have Pit of Heresy. This is a Hive themed dungeon and I love fighting the Hive. We have a short traversal to the first area in Necropolis, which introduces us to the mechanics, which is getting a Hive sword to take out the Shrieker, Knight, and Ogre. Each one has to be taken out in a different way. After this, we have the Ogre Maze, and then onto the Totem area, aka the Chamber of Suffering, where you have to kill a Knight and dunk a charge, and then rinse and repeat 6 times. Again, this was way tougher back in the day without all the health regeneration that we have now. From here, we have to jump down past the spike traps, which can ruin a lot of solo flawless runs, and then a tough jumping section where we have to kill 3 wizards. If you can avoid all the spike traps and not die, then you're off to the final boss. The final boss is a fun fight, going back to the sword mechanics to take out the Shrieker, Ogre, and Knight mini-bosses. We then dunk 3 charges and are ready for boss damage. Zolmak is actually a really fun fight. His solar attacks deal a lot of damage, even today, and then you have Cursed Thrall entering the arena during the damage phase. You have to be cautious of them because if they blow up on you, it can end a flawless run. Again, the dungeon is way easier than it used to be, but it's still a lot of fun to run. The pacing is great, the transition sections are quick, and once you learn the Ogre Maze, you can rip through it. Same goes for the Harrow. This is key to any good dungeon. It should get quicker the more you run it and optimize it. Pacing is key to a great dungeon, and none of this dungeon drags on, and all of the dungeon can be sped up after practice. This is great dungeon design. The unique sword attacks are a fun mechanic, even if it's quite simple. Again, there isn't dungeon specific loot, but the Solo Flawless emblem was the very first Solo Flawless emblem in the game, and it's a pretty nice one. The scale isn't as grand as Shattered Throne in my opinion, but the aesthetic is great. Again, I do love Hive stuff, so I may be a bit biased. I know it only has 1 boss fight, which is the only dungeon in the game to only have 1, but the final boss fight is fun and quick to get to damage phase, and it is a dynamic encounter when fighting the boss, as he can be pretty threatening. Overall, this is a great dungeon to run solo or in a team, and I think it deserves an A tier rating. It's got a solid aesthetic, great pacing, and cool mechanics. Just a very good dungeon. Up next, we have one of my favorite dungeons of all time in Prophecy. This dungeon, despite being almost 5 years old, still holds up quite well from a combat perspective, which I think speaks to the brilliance of the encounter design, as well as to how difficult the Solo Flawless was back in the day. The opening encounter introduces us to the main mechanic of the dungeon, which is making light or dark motes. The first real encounter is a Taken Phalanx boss. The boss arena is super cool, a half sphere which shifts and changes as you dunk your motes. You have to dunk 4 sets of motes to trigger a damage phase, and the damage phase can be pretty tough. The Phalanx can block attacks with its shield, and then Taken Goblins spawn in which can make the boss immune. It can honestly be a very frustrating fight depending on your loadout selection. And even getting to boss damage can be tough because of how tight the arena is and the many enemies and orange bar knights, so the first encounter is very fun. The next area is the Wasteland. Admittedly, this part is pretty boring, but luckily you can rip through it pretty quickly nowadays. Then we head to the Cube Room, which is a super cool encounter. Again, it used to be quite a challenge back in the day. Now it is much easier, but it is still a cool encounter to run. Sadly, it does have some RNG elements which can slow it down, and if this happens, it can feel like it drags on for a little too long, as you have to dunk 6 motes to move on. Then there's a super quick mini-boss fight at the end, and then we're off to one of the greatest traversal sections in the history of Destiny, Rainbow Road. This whole traversal is just cool as hell. You can speed it up when you know what you're doing, but it's always fun to run. It is extremely vast and huge, and the aesthetic is amazing and gives major Rainbow Road vibes. Not sure if that is why I love it so much, because it harkens back to my childhood playing Mario Kart with the homies, but this section is just peak Destiny. It's just so damn cool. And really, the whole aesthetic of the dungeon is just my favorite in the entire game. I think it's so neat and visually stunning. Absolute S tier aesthetic design. Then we get to the final boss, and again, it's S tier, this time for encounter design. The lead up to boss damage used to be really damn hard. You have a super cool triangular shaped room, and until you take down 1 replication of the boss, there's really no safe place to stand. But after you dunk 3 sets of motes, you get to head to damage phase where you jump through the sand, which again is just cool as hell. You have a wipe mechanic where if you stray too far away from the boss for too long, you get 10 stacks of dark entropy and wipe, and the boss can teleport you with its blight attack. It is the ultimate skill gap boss fight. At first, it's kind of difficult as the boss moves away from you and there are enemies who spawn in that you have to deal with. But then, you can actually manipulate these enemies to use to your advantage. You can use them for proccing Radiant with a hammer and making orbs to give more weapon surge. And when you learn the boss's movement patterns, then you can optimize your damage much better. This is just peak boss design. The more you learn the fight, the better damage you will deal. The boss fight also mitigates melee-based builds because of its teleport attack, so you have to consider that when coming up with a damage strategy. But when you overcome all of this and beat the boss, you drop down through the sand again and see an Agent of the Nine. This dungeon to me is S tier. I just love it. The pacing is great, even if the wasteland is a bit boring, and the cube room can drag on a bit if you're unlucky. It is tons of fun to run solo or in a team. The aesthetic is my favorite in the entire game. The encounter structure is also great. Opening with a boss is awesome, then the cube room is super unique, and then you close with a boss. And then you have one of the best traversal sections in the game in Rainbow Road. The loot is old Trials of the Nine gear, but it got refreshed and is pretty decent. The armor set is also pretty dope as well. Oh, and the solo flawless emblem is the best in all of Destiny, and I still rock it to this day. For all these reasons, this dungeon is S tier, and like I said, it may be my favorite dungeon in the entire game. I just love it. Next is Grasp of Avarice. I think the balancing of this dungeon in today's sandbox is the best in the game. The previous dungeons and their bosses can all be one-phased and easily two-phased while solo. I personally feel that when solo, the sweet spot for dungeon bosses is a very tough 2-phase, a decently challenging 3-phase, and quite an easy 4-phase. And with where our power level is now, this dungeon matches these damage thresholds perfectly. The opening part of the dungeon introduces us to the main mechanic of the dungeon, which is to collect engrams and then deposit them in a crystal. This is a fallen dungeon, and again, the aesthetic is S tier. It's all about pirates, and the main mechanic is even tied into this theme. You collect engrams, which is basically treasure, and this gives you Burden of Riches, which is what you deposit into the crystal, and then it is also the wipe mechanic if you hold on to them for too long. I just think it's super cool how relevant the mechanic is to the dungeon. After the opening area, you have a traversal full of secret traps and pitfalls. This is also super cool. This is the first dungeon with booby traps, and they did a wonderful job designing them. They're super fun to discover on a first time run through, and also super fun to run with friends when it's their first time. Tricking your rookie friends into tripping a trap is just so funny. It honestly never gets old. And don't underestimate how good that is for replayability. It makes you want to take your new friends or new blueberries through the dungeon for the first time because it's just a really fun experience. The opening traversal is kind of long, but it doesn't feel long, and that is key. And you can also optimize ways to go even faster. The first boss is an ogre boss fight with the Hive. The fight is pretty cool. You have to collect engrams and deposit them to start the boss fight. One thing I should mention is collecting 10 engrams gives you your super and all of your abilities. Knowing this is crucial for optimizing this dungeon. I love mechanics like this that speed up future runs and make it so that there's a skill gap for getting better at mastering the dungeon. It makes repeat playthroughs so much more fun and incentivizes players to grow and learn. Also, the ogre is pretty threatening to fight, so you have to consider that when thinking about your strategy for damage. This is a tough 2-phase solo and an easy 1-phase in a team. After the ogre boss fight, you have the Sparrow part. This, again, is super cool and unique, and where a lot of flawless runs go to die. But when you learn a good route, then you're good to go. Then you launch towards a big skull, which is super cool. Then we're on to the worst encounter in dungeon history. As a solo, the servitor part drags on, and in a team, there still isn't a ton that you can do to speed it up. And it's not even that it takes that long, it's just so fucking boring. There's no combat difficulty, and the servitors are janky to move. Sometimes you can accidentally push one off the edge, and this is infuriating, as then you are forced to do a whole nother rotation of the servitors. I just despise this encounter. On to the final boss fight, we have another fight that can be greatly sped up when you know what you're doing. You can use the engrams to get supers to take out the tanky as hell yellow bars in the middle, and then you have to deposit a bunch of engrams. Even this can be optimized. You want to deposit the exact right amount, otherwise you have to stay near the crystal during damage so you don't die to Burden of Riches. All these optimizations make learning and perfecting the dungeon fun and worth it. The fight goes even quicker in a team as well. This is a very tough 2-phase solo and a comfortable 3-phase, and an easy 1-phase in a fire team. This was the first dungeon to have a full set of unique weapons and armor. The armor is clean as hell, and the weapons are decent if you get a god roll. This was also released in the 30th anniversary event, so the weapons are all throwbacks to Destiny 1. They're classics. Also, this is the first dungeon to have a master difficulty and introduce Artifice armor. This made running the harder version worth it and gave us a new difficulty to try and conquer. This was a lot of innovation for one dungeon and deserves to be praised. The Solo Flawless emblem is pirate themed, which is perfect, so overall this is a strong A tier dungeon. The only thing keeping it out of S tier is the horrific servitor encounter. I just despise it so much that it just can't be S tier. But this dungeon did do a whole lot of things right. The Solo Flawless back at launch was pretty tough as the boss fights took a lot longer, but even still, it was fair. I just think it's an awesome dungeon and a lot of fun to run solo or in a fire team. Up next is Duality.
The witness opened its mind to me, and I saw my darkest desire made reality.
This is a Cabal-based dungeon. The main mechanic is introduced pretty much immediately when you have to shoot the bell. The aesthetic is perfect given the name, Duality. You have the Nightmare Realm and the regular realm, and the encounters are all designed to be symmetrical, almost mirror versions of everything. I really like how this dungeon is themed. Sadly, the central mechanic with shooting the bell and transporting between realms is janky as hell and has cost many people a flawless run through no fault of their own. And the dungeon is almost 3 years old and this still hasn't been fixed, sadly. Obviously this isn't intended, but it does put a sour taste in your mouth. The first encounter is a boss fight, which is pretty fun, and then you have a traversal to the second vault encounter, which has 3 mini boss fights, and then another traversal to the final boss. I think the encounters in this dungeon are super well designed. The first encounter can drag on a little for my liking when you're solo, but in a team it can be done quite quickly. The second encounter is the same, but high skill players can do the whole mechanic in one go with some good strats and optimizations. And then the final boss suffers from the same thing, where getting to boss damage just drags on a little too long for my liking, at least solo. The boss health pools in this hold up pretty well. There is a high skill gap to making the most out of the damage phases when you're solo, and I think that is good design. You can 2-phase both bosses if you're on point, and if you aren't, it is a pretty comfortable 3-phase. But if you mess stuff up, it can definitely be much longer. Like if you miss a bell on Keitel or don't take out the projections quickly enough on the first boss. This is still one of the tougher solo flawless dungeons to this day because of tight encounter timers and relentless enemies. The scions shooting you during damage on Keitel are very dangerous, and you can even die to the backpacks from the Incendiors blowing up. This was the first dungeon to release after the Subclass 3.0 updates, so Bungie really forces you into running a build with health regeneration as there are very few spots to stand to survive, especially in the final boss fight. The armor set in this dungeon is pretty ugly, but the weapon design is top tier. Some of the coolest weapons we have ever gotten in a dungeon. They aren't really meta or anything, other than Storm Chaser releasing really hot, but they're still cool and have some decent rolls. And Heart Shadow was the dungeon exotic, which was truly the first real dungeon exotic. Yes, we had Wish Ender, but it wasn't a random drop. It is a void sword that is pretty fun to use and looks awesome as hell. The Solo Flawless emblem is pretty clean as well. Overall, I think this dungeon is a solid A tier. Good challenge and encounter design and great theming. It also came out in Season of the Haunted, so the Red Nightmare Realm really fit the theme of the season. A very solid dungeon, but the inconsistency of the main mechanic definitely brings it down a notch. Next up is Spire the Watcher, a Vex-themed dungeon.
Sarah, complex. Vex, destabilized. Opportunity, short. Critical! Meltdown! The reactor, lose everything! End this threat.
I really used to dislike this dungeon, but over time, I have grown to like it more. I think one reason I really didn't like it is because I solo flawlessed it on my very first time attempting it. As a result, I never learned the ins and outs of the mechanics to speed things up. My solo flawless was like 2 hours long because I was just playing it safe. But later on, I made updated solo flawless guides on all the dungeons, and this one grew on me quite a bit. The main mechanic is connecting the dots by getting the arc conductor buff and shooting the nodes. This is probably the lamest main mechanic in the game. So the opening area is just closing 4 circuits, and then you have a pretty tough jumping puzzle until you get to the first encounter. The whole first encounter is literally just shooting nodes on 3 different floors. There are enemies, but you can just literally ignore them. The only reason this encounter is better than the servitor encounter in Grasp of Avarice is if you get good at shooting the nodes and knowing where they all are, you can speed this boring shit up very quickly. But this is a lame as hell encounter. And sadly for me, I kinda suck at knowing where the hell I'm going in video games. So even though I have gotten a lot more proficient at this dungeon, I am still no expert. My expertise is nailing down combat and being good at slaying out, not being quick and figuring out where I need to go. The next boss is the Harpy boss from Garden of Salvation. This encounter also has enemies that pose basically no threat, and then you shoot a ton of nodes to get to damage. Again, you can optimize this a lot to get to damage really quickly, which I like. Then, damage phase has a bit of a skill gap, where the quicker you shoot the eyes, the longer you get to deal damage. And as long as you keep dealing big damage, you can usually 3-phase. There is a damage threshold that will allow you to deal damage even longer, but it is quite difficult to hit as a solo. But in a team, this makes it 1-phaseable and a very easy 2-phase. But overall, this is just a pretty boring encounter. Then we have another tricky traversal with some fans that can ruin a solo flawless. Also, some ad clear and more node shooting. Then we get to the final boss, and again we can speed up getting to damage by a lot if you get proficient at shooting the nodes. However, if you don't know where they all are, this shit can drag on for ages. So you shoot the nodes and trap the boss while avoiding supplicants, which can blow you up. Genuinely, these supplicants are the only threats in this entire dungeon outside of the final boss's attacks. The boss roaming the field is a nice addition, so it teaches you how to kite enemies so that you can accomplish your objectives. This is vastly easier with a team, but as a solo, can provide a decent bit of challenge if you don't know how to manipulate enemy AI. So then you get to damage, and it is a pretty quick damage phase that favors burst DPS. I really like the damage phase actually, as you have to remain mobile and avoid the robot chicken's void lances. Then it's just rinse and repeat. The final boss of this dungeon is really its only redeeming quality as far as I'm concerned. The armor sets are pretty sweet, especially if you like cowboy hats. The weapons are really nothing to write home about either. Actually, this is probably the worst weapon loot pool of all the modern dungeons. Wilderflight has one very niche god roll that is decent, and while I like the long arm, most people aren't farming this dungeon for a good one. And the machine gun is just whatever, but it does have triple tap target lock, which can be good in niche situations. The exotic is Hierarchy of Needs, which has a bit of a cult following and is good in certain situations, but again, nothing really to write home about. The solo flawless emblem is also pretty mid, and the aesthetic of the dungeon, at least to me, is probably the worst in the game. Sure, it's kinda cool, but no skyboxes in the history of Destiny have ever looked bad. The art team always kills it, but as far as comparing it to other dungeon aesthetics, I think it's the worst. Nothing really stands out. That being said, this is a pretty quick dungeon to run, and the final boss is pretty fun, so I will let it squeak into B tier. But to me, there is nothing that stands out with this dungeon. It has the most boring mechanic and the worst aesthetic. That being said, all dungeons in this game are fun to run. So it's not like it's a bad piece of content, it is just that compared to other dungeons, this one just doesn't hold up versus the others, at least in my opinion. So from a dungeon that grew on me and I grew to like and appreciate, we go to a dungeon that has only aged worse over time for me in Ghosts of the Deep.
All who pass through these halls are mine.
The lucky number 7th dungeon to release in Destiny 2. Now, like I said, I love Hive-themed anything. I loved Season of the Witch, I loved the Witch Queen expansion, and I loved the King's Fall raid. So this should be a no-brainer home run for a dungeon. Unfortunately, no. For other dungeons, I talked about pacing, and this dungeon has by far the worst pacing in the entire game. So let's take a look at it. The opening encounter introduces us to reading the runes. So we follow the green goo trails to kill enemies until we kill a Lucent Hive, and then we head back to mid to touch the rune. Then we rinse and repeat this. Sadly, we have to do this 4 times instead of 3. Having to do stuff 4 times isn't the worst thing, but given how long it takes to do one set, having to do 4 just feels like it drags on. It should have been 3, especially because there are 3 fucking Lucent Hive champions. You have a Titan Knight, a Hunter Acolyte, and a Warlock Wizard. Whoever's idea it was to do this 4 times should straight up be fired. I'm sorry, but this was a terrible choice. How this got okayed by groups of playtesters is beyond me. It's just a truly horrible design choice. And this part is hard to speed up even in a fire team thanks to how the enemies only spawn in when the other set dies. Yes, you can memorize all the paths, but even then it's hard to speed up. This is just bad encounter design. If you don't have ways to become more proficient and speed things up, what is the point at trying to get better? So after a long and monotonous first encounter, we have the most boring traversal in all of the dungeons. The long as fuck downward spiral to the core of the earth. Yes, this does give great scale, as it's like, holy shit, we are going miles below the earth's surface. But with the underwater shit slowing you down, it just drags on horribly. I truly despise it. I never farmed a cold comfort simply because I hate rerunning this dungeon. I hate that it takes like 15 minutes in a fire team to reach your first boss fight. It feels monotonous and long for the sake of being long. Then we finally get to the first boss, and this is a pretty cool encounter actually. When you learn where the runes are, you can drastically speed up getting to damage. And if you're in a fire team, one guy can do the runes while the other people stay up top and kill the wizards as they spawn. The pacing of this encounter is great. Fast when you learn what you're doing, but slow if you aren't proficient. Exactly how it should be. So then we get to damage, and this is another horrible design choice. The overshield on this boss is absolutely fucking stupid and needs to go. I despise it. In a fire team, it's not as big a deal because you can burst it down, or just have one player use Arbalest. And you can have a Well of Radiance to help stay alive and deal huge damage. But as a solo, dealing with the overshield can be a massive pain in the ass. I hate this overshield mechanic and hope it never comes back in any dungeon in the future. It's trash. But overall, this is a pretty cool fight. The boss is very tanky at launch, but I did still manage a solo 3 phase, but I do think the boss health pools are a little much. But I also don't. I truly just think the overshield is the problem. If it wasn't for the overshield, these boss health pools would pretty much be perfect for today's sandbox. After we beat this first boss, we have a much shorter traversal, thank God, and it actually has some decent difficulty, especially when the wizards spawn behind you. I have lost at least 2 solo flawlesses here, which definitely feels bad. Then we get to the final boss, and oh lord, getting to damage is tedious as hell. In a fire team, this isn't nearly as bad as each person can take a third of the map and speed up these mechanics substantially. And the mechanics are honestly pretty cool. But as a solo player, the shit drags on to no end. The other crappy thing here is, you don't know where the symbols are until you go to the Lucent Hive rooms. This sucks as it can waste even more time, because it is often beneficial to manipulate what rune you want to finish with to get optimal damage. But you have to run and check the rune, and sometimes you get unlucky and have to backtrack. Again, not really a problem in a team, but annoying as a solo. Another small nitpick is when you crush the ghost, the symbol goes away. This sucks as it's so damn boring doing the mechanics over and over, you sometimes just zone out. And if you didn't watch the symbol just one time, then you're fucked. I don't like this. So then, when you finally do all this boring mechanic and finally get to damage, you again have an overshield to contend with, and then a wizard who is not the easiest to hit. But this just adds a skill gap which isn't bad. But again, the egregious part is having to fucking take down another overshield. Again, I don't mind the boss health pools, I just think the overshields need to go. So now let's talk about the good of the dungeon. The aesthetic is S tier. Again, hive shit is cool as hell, and this dungeon is no exception. It looks amazing. And I also love deep sea stuff in real life, so this is really cool. This is one of my favorite aesthetics in all of Destiny. It's awesome. And Oryx, the boss of my favorite raid, being down in the final boss room is also cool as hell. It's just a very neat dungeon visually. The solo flawless emblem is really clean as well. The armor set is the best dungeon set in the entire game, and it's not even close. It may be the best armor set period. The weapons are pretty mid outside of the Cold Comfort God roll. The exotic is also pretty mid in the Navigator, which is a strand trace rifle. But again, my gradings at the end of the day come down to combat and how fun a dungeon is to play, and I dread running this dungeon. I mostly play solo, and it's not a fun solo. But even in a fire team, I just don't like running this dungeon. So sadly, I have to give it a C tier rating. The day 1 experience was super neat, but repeat run-throughs feel like a literal chore. I do not enjoy it at all. So from probably my least favorite dungeon to run, we have my favorite dungeon to run in Warlord's Ruin.
Death is not the end for an Ahamkara. We'll secure the bones and make sure this can't happen again. Something is different about this one. Even like this, in its silence, it could move worlds.
I made a video shortly after it came out detailing why this was the best dungeon Bungie ever made. I know I'm extremely partial to Prophecy because it just reminds me of a simpler time in Destiny, and the aesthetic is amazing, but I do believe Warlord's Ruin is the best dungeon they've ever made, so let's talk about why. This is a Scorn themed dungeon, the first of its kind. I hate fighting the Scorn, but I do think Scorn are really cool. And there's also lots of Taken in this dungeon as well. So we start out with a short traversal to the first encounter, which is a boss fight. So that is the first thing this dungeon does well. It actually has 3 boss encounters, which is super fucking awesome. Who doesn't love fighting bosses? And they're all very unique, which we will get to. So you are introduced to the main mechanic in the first encounter where you have to stand next to a totem to capture it. And if you capture both, you get longer to deal damage. This is great design. It adds a skill gap to get a longer damage phase. The ads are pretty relentless, as is the boss, so it can sometimes be challenging to capture both totems. Also, you get pulled into a jail with spikes that can kill you if you don't shoot yourself out. The faster you get out, the more likely you are to cap the totem. Again, just brilliant design. The damage phase is quick and hectic thanks to the short window to capture the totems. And it is so quick to get to damage phase that you often don't have time to get your super for the next phase, which is something you rarely see. From here, we are locked in a jail cell and need to puzzle solve to find a way out. This was a killer on day 1, but a super cool idea. But once you're out, you have to navigate your way through a maze to escape. And the maze has booby traps. Yes, the traps from Grasp of Avarice are back and fun as ever. But in future runs, it is easy to get out of the jail and navigate your way through the hallways and avoid the traps and enemies. We then have a transition section as we head up the mountain to the next part of the castle. And this brings us to encounter number 2, which is another boss, this time a taken ogre. Getting to damage doesn't drag too much solo, but it's much quicker with a fire team. But the best players in the world can cap 4 totems at once with big brain strats, even solo. Again, this is great game design. Sadly, the totem spawning is janky as hell and often puts a damper on things, but at least in this dungeon it just slows you down rather than killing you like in Duality. Then we get to damage phase, and this is the second longest damage phase in Destiny, and it was the longest until Vesper's host. So while the first boss prioritizes burst DPS, this one prioritizes sustained DPS and total damage. In a fire team, a 1 phase is doable with some optimization, and as a solo, a 2 phase is doable, but most people will 3 or 4 phase, which isn't too bad. Also, triggering DPS is different with lighting the braziers instead of capturing totems, so that's pretty cool as it adds a new mechanic. Then we have another transition section. This one is quite long and has some very tricky parts which can ruin a flawless. You have the spinning rock room where rocks crumble away at your feet. There are dangerous wizards and snipers, and the spinning rocks can also be a big issue. But after some practice, you will learn the best pathing. And then past here, there are lots of enemies still to kill to get to the final boss, as well as some tricky jumping sections. I didn't mention it, but people have also learnt to abuse Lumina grappling to optimize the traversal, something that Ghosts of the Deep could never dream of. These kind of optimizations and skill ceilings are what make Destiny great. So when you do get to the final boss, you have a giant meatball to fight. The lead up to damage is chaotic as hell, with blights spreading miasma on the floor, scions constantly spawning, and some very strong yellow bars that you will have to kill quickly to spawn a totem. And then you have to punch the hex drinkers or you will wipe. Again, the best players can actually capture 4 totems, and in a fire team, this is pretty easy to do. And when you do, again you are rewarded with a longer damage phase. I said it before, but this is great encounter design, rewarding excellence and mastery. Damage phase can be very hectic, which makes consistent damage challenging, especially as a solo. You rotate through 3 floors, and then you do damage on 3 rocks. You can usually do 2 full cycles to kill the boss while solo. And in a fire team, you can usually beat him in 2 or 3 floors. So while this boss fight can definitely take a long time, especially solo, it never feels very long. And that is absolutely crucial. You're dealing damage every few minutes, so even if you don't have the best damage phase, you will be back to damage before you know it. With Ghosts of the Deep, if you fuck up a damage phase, you're pissed because you now have a 10-minute slog to get back to damage, and this feels awful. Warlord's Ruin never feels bad. The dungeon is a masterclass in pacing. The transitions are long as well, just like Ghosts, but again, they never feel long. You aren't just dropping through a tube for 5 minutes and slogging through water. You're avoiding traps, shooting enemies, going through tight corridors. The scene is changed up frequently enough that it never feels boring, and that is absolutely crucial. And then being able to optimize things to speed up traversal and even the lengths of your damage phase makes mastery worth it and helps you to complete it much quicker than early run-throughs. This makes repeat run-throughs much more enjoyable because you are rewarded for mastering the dungeon. I can't stress how amazing this dungeon is. I think it is truly the best dungeon in Destiny 2. I just love it so much. The aesthetic is top tier, reminding me of an old castle. A lot of people said it has Dungeons and Dragons vibes, but I'm unfamiliar with that universe. Regardless, the aesthetic is incredible. It has more secrets than basically any other dungeon, encouraging repeat run-throughs to unlock new doors. Buried Bloodline, the exotic, is one of the best weapons in the entire game. The quest for the Catalyst is cool as hell with a special combat encounter before the final boss, which is really neat. The armor set is Ice Hiker themed, which is also pretty neat. Indebted Kindness is one of the best weapons in the game, and the other weapons have decent rolls and perk pools as well, even if they aren't meta. And then finally, the Solo Flawless emblem is just decent. This is a fun dungeon to run in a fire team or solo, and to me, it is peak Destiny. S+ tier dungeon. It does so many things right. I just adore this dungeon. So next we have Vesper's Host, a Fallen themed dungeon.
The corruption is spreading. Get out! Get out!
Bungie killed it with this one. The opening area introduces you to the scanner and operator buffs, and then you have a short traversal to the first encounter. The first encounter has you rolling through waves of ads. You need good ad clear and burst DPS for the yellow bars and brigs. It's just a fast-paced, fun opening encounter. After this, you have a traversal to the next encounter that isn't super challenging. There's a maze-type section with the servitor boss that we have to avoid, sort of similar in a way to Pit of Heresy. Then when we get past the servitor, there's just a short jog to the first boss, Rhaenix, a group of 10 servitors. Getting to damage feels a little long sometimes because sometimes a big captain takes a while to spawn, but outside of that, it's really well paced. The exploder shanks are also dangerous as hell. We are also introduced to the suppressor augment here. When we get to damage, we have to deal damage to all the servitors at once. This is really unique boss design and I just love it. It has brought waveframe GLs and AoE type supers into the forefront. This is not something we see very often, so it was a fun challenge to overcome on day one. And speaking of day one, this had the first ever contest mode, which is super fun and challenging. I loved everything about it. Sorry, I should clarify. The first ever dungeon contest mode, and it was so much fun. Contest raids and dungeons are peak Destiny and make all the time and practice and farming god rolls worth it. Sadly, I do have to add this in. Bungie reduced the number of servitors from 10 to 6, but they didn't rebalance the health pools. As a result, this super unique boss feels a lot shittier to fight than it used to. Hopefully Bungie rebalances this at some point in the future. After the servitor boss, we again have a traversal on our way to the final boss. The final boss is the Corrupted Puppeteer, and it's no joke. Getting to damage was quite challenging when the dungeon first released. The Red Room was tough as hell solo, as you have 4 puppet clones shooting at you, plus the boss. So you need to bring a damn strong build. Then when you head to damage, it is the ultimate skill gap boss phase. You have to learn the boss's movement patterns as well as its attack patterns with the lightning striking the floor. But if you do, you are greatly rewarded. The best players in the world can squeak out a 2 phase when solo, but if you aren't dealing constant damage to the boss, you can be looking at up to a 10 phase. It is a very long damage phase, the longest in the game. Again, it's just super unique in counter design and rewards you for mastery, exactly how it should be. Yes, fire teams can basically cheese the boss with 3 Well of Radiances and Grand Overtures, but that is not a knock on the encounter. It rewards good movement and consistent damage and very unique playstyles like building into being able to get 3 supers in 1 damage phase. It's truly unique. The transitions in this dungeon are also long, but they don't feel long. There are also a ton of secrets, just like Warlord's Ruin. It's fun to run in a fire team, but a little chaotic and long as a solo. I don't love soloing this one, but it doesn't mean it isn't a good dungeon. The armor set is alright, and the weapons are some of the best in the entire game. The contest and solo flawless emblems are also both pretty cool, and Icebreaker is one of the best exotics in the game. Sadly, for months and months after its release, it dealt with tons of issues, from secret chest not opening to tether being disabled forever. The final boss would sometimes soft lock, costing people a flawless run. The catalyst wouldn't work for some people. There was just tons of issues, and you hate to see it. It put a damper on an otherwise wonderful dungeon. For me, it isn't as good as Warlord's Ruin, but it is still great. I would love to place it in S tier, but with all the bugs and issues it has had, I think I have to put it in A tier. If it worked as intended, I think it would be S, but we don't live in an ideal world, and these issues do hamper the experience. The bugs, coupled with the terrible changes to Rhaenix, making a fight that was once one of the coolest in Destiny into an annoying slog that isn't balanced properly. I just can't give it an S tier rating anymore. That being said, Bungie has really refined their dungeon formula, and I have been impressed with how they balance things around Prismatic. Yes, the dungeon health pools are pretty tanky, but you can still get solo 3 phases with optimization, and that's nice to see. And fire team 1 phases are definitely doable, and that's key. They should always be 1 phaseable in a good and coordinated fire team. So now we have the latest dungeon to release in Sundered Doctrine.
Play a game with me, Guardian. Imagine yourself among the dread. All these secrets, all these hidden passages.
This is a Dread and Hive themed dungeon. It's nice that we get a Dread dungeon to round out having a dungeon for every enemy faction. The aesthetic of the dungeon is also Ralk's Pyramid, which I think is cool as hell, so it gets big points for aesthetic. This dungeon also had a contest mode that was a fun challenge, though it wasn't as difficult as Vesper's Host. The opening traversal is nice and quick, where we get into the opening encounter, which is anything but quick. I hate this encounter solo, and even in a fire team, it can drag on a little long if you get unlucky with the symbols in the third round, where you may have to use certain lamps to send the beam to certain rooms. I just find it super annoying and tedious, and I really dislike it. But after this encounter, we have a super cool transition section with some Indiana Jones inspired traversal. This is really awesome, and then we have to open a door which introduces us to the wheel mechanic for the first boss, the Zoetic lock set. Once again, Bungie absolutely killed it with this boss design. We have maybe the most unique dungeon encounter in all of Destiny. You have 4 bosses to shoot at which all share a health pool. Much like Rainix, this forces you to think outside the box for what is the optimal damage strategy. I just love it so much. And another thing it does extremely well is it allows for players to have full agency over when they want to do damage. You can do a death by 1,000 cuts strategy where you have tons of 10-second damage phases like what I did in my solo Flawless, or you can opt for a longer damage phase with the caveat that it takes longer to get to damage. And you can even have phase lengths in between, which Sutek takes advantage of by using one super long damage phase and then one 2-wheel damage phase to optimize for the world record solo speedrun. I adore so much about this encounter. As I said, it is probably the most unique encounter in all of Destiny. Depending on what is on the wheel when the Zoetic lock set scans it, any number of things can happen, which makes the fight unpredictable and variable, allowing this fight to never feel the same way twice. Unfortunately, it isn't all sunshine and rainbows. Just like with Vesper's Host, I have to dock points here for releasing a dungeon that wasn't fully baked. This boss, as of the making of this video, still doesn't take crit damage, even though the game shows that you are. But even though it's showing crit numbers, it's registering as body shot damage. And it also does not work with weapon surges. It is just such a sad reality for what is one of the greatest dungeon encounters in the history of Destiny. After this fight, we head to the final boss. It is a reasonably length traversal section with a light beam puzzle along the way. And then we get to the final boss. This boss fight is actually pretty good. It is far less hectic than the Corrupted Puppeteer, so it was much easier on contest mode. But it is still a fun encounter, and you can greatly speed up getting to damage if you know the truths and lies of Destiny, which is something I didn't even talk about in the first encounter. But basically, the codes you input in the first encounter are truths. And then in the boss room, you have to light up the lie and burn it away and darken the truth. So if you know the lore, you don't even need to kill the truth teller bat. You just do the mechanics and get to damage very quickly. I love a skill gap that allows you to get to damage faster, so this is great design. And the mechanics where you move the lights around are also pretty neat. During damage, there are a few different strategies that you can use to kill the boss. I do think this boss is a little too tanky personally, but that is just where we're at in a post-Final Shape sandbox, so I get the decision. The loot in the dungeon is all really good, even if the weapons aren't in the best weapon archetypes. Personally, I love them all, and the origin trait on these weapons is amazing, and the armor is pretty unique as well. The dungeon exotic, Finality's Augur, is one of the most unique weapons in Destiny history, and it gives a new meaning to the word exotic. I do have the Catalyst which gives it bait and switch, but I haven't got to use it enough to make a final verdict on how strong it is. That being said, the time gating to unlock the Catalyst sucks balls, but the actual things we had to do to unlock it were pretty cool, culminating in opening a secret vault door after the final boss. The secrets in this dungeon were pretty great. All in all, much like Vesper's Host, I think this dungeon in concept is S tier, but in reality, with bugs and things not working properly, I have to knock it down to A tier, which is a real shame. The opening encounter does suck, but the rest of the dungeon makes up for it. But like I said, those few knocks against it don't allow me to put it into S tier. It's a shame that the game has had so many bugs lately because truly, the last 3 dungeons Bungie has put out have been amazing experiences. Truly my favorite content in the franchise. Here's hoping they can tighten up quality in the future. So let's recap. Shattered Throne was A tier. I know it may not be so solid now, but for the time it was revolutionary. Pit of Heresy also gets A tier. Cool aesthetic and a quick and fun experience. Prophecy is S tier with one of my favorite aesthetics in the game and boss fights that still hold up decently well to this day. Grasp of Avarice gets an A tier. Amazing theming which ties well into the mechanics, and the introduction of booby traps was just awesome. And then we had the return of some fan favorite weapons from D1 including Galahorn. If not for the most boring encounter in dungeon history, it probably would be S tier. Duality, A tier. The the first dungeon in the 3.0 subclass world, it really ramped up the difficulty for dungeons. Very cool aesthetic and really well-paced encounters with well-tuned boss health pools. Spire the Watcher, B tier. The lamest aesthetic of any dungeon and pretty boring overall, mixed with a very weak weapon pool. The final boss does make up for it though. Ghost of the Deep, C tier. The opening encounter and opening traversal are enough to put anyone to sleep. And then the bosses having the overshield really ruins the health pool balance, which without the overshield would actually be in a very good spot. And then throw on how long it takes to get to damage when solo on the final boss, it just makes this whole dungeon a bore. But credit where it's due, it's got a great aesthetic and the best dungeon armor in the game. Warlord's Ruin, S tier. 3 bosses, perfect pacing, and minimal mechanics. My kind of dungeon. Probably my favorite in all of Destiny, and I didn't think anything would ever overtake Prophecy. Vesper's Host, A tier. Introduced contest dungeons, and I think with that philosophy, Bungie has tried to make dungeons slightly more mechanic heavy for better or worse. Sadly, it launched pretty buggy, and the changes to Raynix have knocked it out of S tier and into A tier. Hoping Bungie fixes Raynix, and then it does have potential to go back to S. And finally, Sundered Doctrine, A tier. I just really dislike the opening encounter. If you just had to do one truth puzzle and line up 3 lenses, then this dungeon would feel so much better. Hopefully Bungie can fix the problems with Zoetic Lockset, and if they do, then this dungeon will be a lot better for it. But as it stands right now, I have to keep it out of S tier. And that is it for my dungeon tier list. I put a lot of thought, time, and effort into this video, so if you enjoyed it, please like the video. And let me know in the comments what your tier list would look like. I know some people love Spire the Watcher and hate Warlord's Ruin for some reason, so I would like to hear your reasoning for why. Anyways, that's it from me. Thanks for watching if you're still here, and I will catch you in the next one. Take care. Hey, if you're still here, then thanks so much for watching to the end. If you like what I do and you want to support me further, then consider becoming a channel member. You'll get your name featured on the end screen, custom badges, and other cool rewards. You can also join my community Discord if that interests you, and if you want to see me stream, be sure to follow me on Twitch at itstizzle7 where I stream semi-regularly. Those are linked in the description. Anyways, that's enough self-promotion. Thanks for watching. Take care.